Hey everybody, it's Mitch, and welcome to my next video. Today, we are going to be answering the big question of what is Dungeons & Dragons 3.5? But before we can get to that question, we got a few other questions we have to answer. First, we need to answer what is a tabletop RPG, and then what is Dungeons & Dragons? So we're going to be answering those questions, and then finally, once we've answered those two, we will answer the question of what is Dungeons & Dragons 3.5? So let's get started with it. So first off, what is a tabletop RPG? What makes it so different than everything else? Well, a tabletop RPG, it's not a video game. It's not an arcade game. It's not anything like that. I've heard so many misconceptions. Not so much from people in the community, but generally from people who don't play Dungeons and Dragons or tabletop RPG games. A lot of them just have no idea what it even is. So that's what this video is about. So basically, at its heart, what a tabletop RPG is it is a role-playing game. That's what RPG stands for. It is a tabletop role-playing game. Basically, you and a bunch of your friends are going to gather around a table, or now that it's 2022, 2021, people are going to be gathering around their computers at the internet. That happens a lot now. Hopefully we can get back to actual tabletops, but and we are you're going to have a character. You're going to print up a little character sheet. If I have one around here somewhere, maybe. I don't, weirdly enough. And you're going to take that character sheet, and that's going to be your character. You're going to immerse yourself in that character. That is you for that session. Unless you're the DM, then you're everything else. We'll get into that in a sec. But like, you are your character. You you talk for your character. You dictate what your character says. Like, that character is you, for all intents and purposes. Now there are going to be some differences. Like, you can play your character very different from yourself, and a lot of people do. That's one of the fun things about a tabletop RPG, is you can be something you're not. You can go out and be some crazy barbarian. Like, I'm no barbarian, but I can go out and be one if I want in D&D. I can play one. Like, that's really cool. I can play a lot of different things. Now, in D&D, you're also going to be using dice a lot. Just nice physical dice. I happen to have some just lying right here. It's really hard to show to a camera because gravity, but yeah, you can see there's a D6. So when you're kind of used to looking at a D8 there, more D6s. Let me grab some things that aren't so common. So there's a D4 and a D12. See, they look a little different. That the D stands for how many sides. D10. Let's see, where's their big important one? Weirdly, here's a D, and our D20. It does look different than a D12. I know they look real similar. They're not. And I actually picked ones from the same set too, so that makes it even harder to tell the difference. But I assure you, they are different. So you play with those. You roll the dice, and depending on what the dice say, that's going to handle basically any element of chance that could come up. Because your character might be good at something, but that doesn't mean he's always going to succeed. So you roll the dice and you see if he succeeds in that particular instance. You have things that add to the dice, so you may have a better or worse chance of pulling something off, but there's always a chance of success and there's always a chance of failure in almost every tabletop RPG. So yeah, that's one thing with it. A lot of the game is in the mind. There's certain aspects to it that can be done on that can actually be physically manifested to some extent. You can get miniatures. So a lot of times people will use a map, particularly for combat. I happen to have one right here. I was prepared. So this is a typical standard battle map. It is two-sided because some games use your standard grid, others use a hex grid. So really just depends on the game that you're playing. I've played in games that do both hex and standard grids. But what you can do is you can lay out your miniatures on, sorry, I'm rolling up the map, but you can lay out your miniatures on the battle map, and then it'll give you some physical representation of what your character and what the monsters and everything look like. Now, how accurate that is really depends a lot on your game. A lot of games, the DM can't really afford. The DM and the players can't really afford, a million miniatures to have things be super accurate. So a lot of the time you end up with like things that look nothing like things representing things, and you really just have to imagine things. So yeah, basically there's just different size categories, and it comes down to just understanding how big things are. Like I've used all sorts of minis to. I've used dragons to represent like giants because I just didn't have any more giant minis, so I had to, you know, use dragon minis to represent giants because they were the only thing I had of the right size. It happens, and you just have to, keep things in your mind like that. Um, some people get way more into it and they have tons and tons and tons of minis, and they're able to be a lot more accurate with things. It really just depends on the person. So it can vary a lot. Heck, some people will even dress up as their character to try and immerse themselves more deeply. Some players, when they're playing the game, they will play some styles of play, everybody, as soon as they sit down, is their character. Everything that comes out of their mouth is what their character says, and it's just a very highly immersive game. Other game styles, people talk out of character all the time, and it's really only when they say it's really only and basically and it's really only when they say, hey, I'm speaking in character, or when they change their voice, that yes, they are speaking in character. It varies quite a bit from game to game and player to player and everything. So the game can vary a lot in that regard. There are many different play styles, but the thing that really drives it all together is it's all done with pencil and paper, to keep track of all your stats and statistics. It's all done at a table, typically, although now people are using the internet and talking with webcams, kind of like I'm doing to you guys right now, except for you're not watching live. And yeah, that's basically how the game, how tabletop roleplay works. Is there's dice, there's you have your character sheets. Yeah, it's a lot of it's a lot of fantasy. A lot of stuff is in the mind. The game world, it's done by the DM or GM. It really depends on the game, which one you call that, and the person as well. So basically, your dungeon master or game master is what DM and GM stand for, and they are interchangeably used terms in the community. Basically, what you do is basically they create the world. The world is generated by your DM or GM. They're going to make everything. They're going to say, okay, this is what the town looks like. This is this is that there is a town. This is the map of the world. This is there's a forest here, or there's they design everything from scratch. Like sometimes they use modules to help build things up, but a lot of the time they build everything from scratch. And basically the players then interact and engage with this world that the DM or GM created. and the GM will, of course, use various media to convey their world to them. They'll often show them maps of the world in order that they created in order to let the player have a feel for what the world is like. Sometimes they won't show them the whole map. Sometimes they'll only show them the parts of the map that are relevant, because they assume their character wouldn't know what the whole map looks like. They don't know the whole world. They don't get to know everything because their character, doesn't know what the whole world looks like. Like, I don't know. I don't have like a map of every country on the world. Like, I can't do that. I don't know what every country looks like and everything. No. So, the players likely wouldn't either. So because their character doesn't have that, especially seeing this is a medieval fantasy, a lot of these characters aren't going to have knowledge beyond their area. So it's fairly common for DMs and GMs to only show the immediate area map. And they may or may not have even made the rest of the world map. Really depends on the GM. And a lot of DMs and GMs, even if they haven't made the rest of the world map, they'll make it feel like they have, so that it doesn't seem like the world's just being made up as they enter it, even though it might be. Some DMs and GMs are very good at conveying and making it look like that's not the case when it very much is. So yeah, that's really what the game's all about. Sometimes you fight monsters. Although I guess we're just talking about tabletops in general, so it's not even always a medieval fantasy. Some games take place in the future. Some games take place in the present. There's all sorts of different stuff, and depending on where it's set, the information you have might be different. If it's a modern game, some games are actually set in the real world, so they might be like, yeah, go use Google Maps. There's your map. So yeah, it really, really depends a lot. I'm more familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, particularly 3.5. So that's why I was kind of assuming that for a bit. But I forgot that, some games actually do go more in depth on a lot of other stuff, go into other realms besides medieval fantasy. So it all just comes down to that. But even in most modern games, you're generally not playing yourself. In fact, actually playing as yourself is kind of a novel, interesting idea, because that's not what you normally do. So yeah, I think I've covered tabletop RPGs for the most part. So which is kind of the big subject. So let's talk about Dungeons and Dragons specifically. So Dungeons and Dragons was, I think, the first tabletop RPG. If not, it was one of the first, and it was like the first to get really big, and it still is by far the biggest. Although that wasn't always true. There was a time where it wasn't, and we will talk about that. So basically, Dungeons and Dragons, it came out in 1974 on January 1st, apparently. I actually just Googled that, or I asked Siri, but and I'm pretty sure she Googled it. But anyways, yes, it came out back in 1974, and that was the original tabletop game. Dungeons and Dragons is a medieval fantasy game. You have characters like fighters and clerics and rogues, and although I think some of these classes were originally kind of hard to get in the original Dungeons and Dragons, but you had these and wizards. Of course, wizards. I mean, the company that makes Dungeons and Dragons is called Wizards of the Coast. So yes, this game was it was actually largely inspired by Tolkien's work, which, funny enough, can be seen very much more so in the original versions of the game, before they got sued by the Tolkien estate and were forced to make some changes to make it to make some things less of a Tolkien ripoff. True story. So yeah, That's old news. That was some like back in like the 70s and 80s or whatever, probably 70s. And I'm sure the Tolkien estate jumped on that pretty quick. But yes, so that's the original Dungeons and Dragons. Um, it's all about monsters like orcs and goblins and dragons. You fight on a grid, a standard square grid battle mat. You fight using usually a D20 system for most Dungeons and Dragons systems. So you'll be using this where you roll a D20, and depending on the result, that will determine how things go. The game's actually changed quite a bit over the years. The original Dungeons and Dragons and then Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which I'm not super familiar with, but I believe they used a system where you rolled a dice, and that kind of and it was a system more similar to what you see in other tabletop role-playing games now, where you roll dice and you need to roll low on the dice in order to do good. I believe that was how it was. I could be very wrong. I have never actually played those two particular versions of the game. But based on what I've heard about them, that seems like that's probably the case. So yeah. And basically it's but the game has evolved. Starting with third edition, the game evolved into one where you want to roll more, or you have things, and then you want to you want to roll high to beat things. So if somebody has such and such of an AC, you want to roll, and you want to roll high so that you can overcome their armor class. Although I think I actually might be wrong. I think it was a rolling high system. But I don't think there were as many bonuses back then as there are now. Bonuses became a much bigger thing. Then again, I'm not sure. I've been so long. I have. Apparently, it gets really confusing for Dungeons and Dragons and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons also being known as Second Edition. So yeah. So that's Dungeons and so that's a lot of what Dungeons and Dragons is. It's a particular form of tabletop role-playing game, which is why we covered what a tabletop role-playing game was first, because you really need to understand that to understand what Dungeons and Dragons specifically is. And as I've been alluding to, there are versions of Dungeons and Dragons. There was the original Dungeons and Dragons, which it said came out in 1974 on January 1st. Weirdly enough, apparently they wanted to start the new year right. Then they came out with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons later. Then they came out with Third Edition. That came out, I believe, in the 90s. And then they came out with I think the late 90s. Then they came out with 3.5, because the thing with third edition is they decided that it was sort of a beta. They made some books for it, and basically after having made the game, made some expansion books, they realized there were some issues with it, and they talked to the community, and they made patches to the game. Effectively, this was before the day of the internet. Well, the internet was around, but this was, when the internet was still young, and patches in games wasn't really a thing yet. They made some effective patches by just reprinting a new slightly improved version of the game, one that's highly compatible with third edition. So unlike other versions where the games are so different that there's really no easy way to make old material work, but you can with third edition and 3.5. So that's how that game worked. Now then they went to make fourth edition, and this is where Dungeons and Dragons actually lost its supremacy. Dungeons and Dragons was the big tabletop role-playing game, all the way up until 4th edition hit. 4th edition is where it lost its supremacy, because nobody liked 4th edition. I mean, okay, there were people that liked it, but a lot of people really did not like 4th edition. And because of that, a game called Pathfinder actually was created by actually people who worked for Wizards of the Coast. Well, worked past tense, like they did not work for them at the time. Basically, people either quit or were fired, and they started working on their own game, and it actually ended up surpassing Dungeons and Dragons because, well, 4th edition was just bad. Like nobody wanted to play it. So Pathfinder became the reigning game when 4th edition was big. The Wizards tried to push 4th edition, but it just didn't get a lot of traction. Then recently, actually, this one actually only came out a few years back. They came out with 5th edition, which is at time of recording the newest game on the market for Dungeons and Dragons, and it's also the most popular tabletop RPG. Dungeons and Dragons with 5th edition was able to reclaim its spot as the #1 role-playing game. 5th edition is very similar to 3rd edition in a lot of ways. The basic mechanics are very, very similar, but they slim down a lot of the more complicated things, and they kind of try to make the game a little bit more beginner friendly, actually a lot more beginner friendly. They tried to focus less on the rules are less dense, so it's easier to focus on the role playing aspects of the game. So yeah, that's 5th edition, and that's Dungeons and Dragons in a nutshell. Like it's several different versions. 5, I guess sort of 6 since there's 3.5, but 3.5 is very, very similar to 3rd. In fact, nobody plays 3rd edition anymore because everybody plays 3.5. Okay, there are a few people that play 3rd and not 3.5, but very few. I have met only a handful of people that do that in my life. But I have met at least one. Actually, I think it was just one guy, but I assume there's more than just him out there. But yeah, yeah, that's Dungeons and Dragons. It's a medieval style tabletop RPG. It's Tolkien inspired, but it's inspired by more than just Tolkien. It's basically all of medieval fantasy. It's just Tolkien's kind of the big dominator in that field. Like if you think medieval fantasy, you think the Lord of the Rings, you think the Hobbit. You don't think there's not a lot of other big names that come up when you think that, which is a big part of why Dungeons and Dragons was inspired by that. And a lot of medieval fantasy video games were actually inspired from Dungeons and Dragons. Like if you look at games like Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy was very much inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. Like I've played the first Final Fantasy game, and it is very, very clearly inspired. It's very, very clearly inspired from Dungeons and Dragons. Like the way everything works in that is so Dungeons and Dragons. Like it's not even funny. The newer ones, they've kind of moved on and kind of done their own thing since, but the roots of Final Fantasy, like Final Fantasy 1, are very heavily inspired by D&D. So yeah. So that's D&D. Wow, this video is getting long, but it's a really, really dense subject, so I guess I kind of has to be. So 3.5, we've kind of discussed it a little bit already. It is, of course, the third and a half edition. As I said, they released 3rd edition, and then they released the 3.5 edition a few years later after, getting word back from the community about how the 3rd edition was working. They made some changes in order to better balance the game and to fix some issues that the game had to make it just flow better. And they did a pretty good job with that. They really listened to the community when they were making it. Now, the game is by far is hardly a balanced game, but it is. They did try. They did legitimately try, and the game is rich with lore. That is one of the things that I really like about Dungeons and Dragons is there's so much lore in the game. Like the different races all have histories with each other. There's various different deities that all have various different interactions with the race and various different ways that they communicate with the world. Like the game is very, very rich and there's a lot of depth to it. And then when DMs create their own, it gets, even more interesting. And the players, of course, create depth to the game as well by, the way they play their character and how their character is. Since the story does focus on the characters. That is one thing I forgot to mention. That's true for pretty much all tabletop role-playing games, is the main character is all of the players. There's actually multiple main characters. And they all get to interact however they feel like, which is interesting and it's a collaborative story. It's the players being the main characters and the dungeon masters controlling everything else, but not controlling the players. So basically it's a world written by one person, but the main characters of the story they have no control over and are doing their own thing, which creates for a very, very interesting and dynamic world and story. It really does, and that's one of the things that I love about Dungeons and Dragons the most. But anyways, back to 3.5. 3.5 is there's a large number of rules. I have a few of the books right here. So I got like the monster manual right here. I have the Dungeon Master's Guide. There's a couple paper towels sticking out of it. That's because I accidentally spilled some water on it the other day. Hopefully it's all right. But I put some paper towels in there and kind of shut the book to hopefully sandwich the water in and keep the pages flat and hopefully minimize the damage. We'll see how it worked. My player's handbook took a bit of a hit too, but that's across the room, and I don't think you want to stare at my kitchen for a few minutes or a few seconds. So we'll have to skip showing that one for now. But yeah, those are the main books. There are you use that battle map like I showed before. I still have that. If you want to see it again, I can. I don't want to unroll the whole thing, but you got your squares. And the battle map's really nice. You don't have to use this particular one, but this one's particularly nice. It's made by ChessX. Not sponsored, by the way. I wish. I actually legit do wish. If ChessX is watching, I got my business email. Anyways, yeah. So that's so 3.5. It's a very complicated game. There are a lot of rules for everything. There's a very steep learning curve for this particular game, but that's good and bad. Once you've learned the game, it makes the game so much more rich and dynamic, and it just feels right. Because the rules are just so comprehensive, but it is difficult to learn. It really is. Took me a little while to get the hang of it. I have a lot of new players in my game, and a lot of them are still do struggle with the rules from time to time. Although they're getting pretty good at it, to be honest. So yeah, it's a great game with a lot of depth. There are so many different classes, and oh yeah, Dungeons and Dragons, it's a class-based system. If I didn't mention, so basically, you have various different classes, and you take levels in those classes, and that's how you advance and level up your character, is by adding more classes onto your character, or adding more class levels. So you can either add more classes, or you can add level up in your classes, just get more features from that class, and that'll make you stronger. So yeah, it's hard to explain really how that works. This is already a 30-minute video. So yeah, that's Dungeons and Dragons 3.5. It's very, very complicated. Um, yeah, I might have to do a part 2 to this at some point, but I think I've got the basics of what Dungeons and Dragons is. Hopefully, you now understand the game a little bit better than you did before. Um, but yeah, if you enjoyed the video, consider giving it a like. Maybe subscribe to the channel for more D&D 3.5 content. And ring that notification bell so you never miss out on a video. And maybe share this video with people who aren't that interested in Dungeons and Dragons so that they can, learn just what it is. Because, quite honestly, a lot of people don't know. So yeah, leave a comment down below to just sort of just leave a comment. Let me know what you guys think of the video. Anything I might have missed about what what a tabletop role playing game is, or Dungeons and Dragons 3.5 specifically is. So yeah, I'd always loved hearing from you guys. But anyways, as always, I'm Mitch, and I'll be seeing you